In the darkest years of the 20th century, when the world seemed to tremble under the shadow of tyranny, a silent tension spread across nations. The winds of war were rising once again. Europe, still healing from the wounds of the First World War, watched with growing fear as new threats emerged, threats that challenged freedom itself. This is the story of that struggle, the story of those who refused to bow, and the story of how one of the greatest battles for freedom began. After World War I, the Treaty of Versailles left Germany severely punished and humiliated, stripped of land, wealth, and dignity. Millions suffered from unemployment and inflation. People stood in long lines for bread. Children starved. Families who once lived in comfort now fought daily for survival. And in this suffering, anger began to grow. It is in such moments of desperation that dangerous ideas are born. Across Europe, political divisions deepened. New ideologies rose, some promising hope, others demanding obedience. The world had no idea that these sparks would soon ignite a firestorm that would engulf continents. In the early 1930s, a powerful leader emerged in Germany. His speeches were fiery, emotional, and filled with promises that Germany would rise again, that its people would regain their honor, and that the nation would reclaim its lost strength. Many people, desperate for change, followed him. They did not yet see the darkness hiding behind the words. They did not see how their hope was being turned into a weapon. As Germany rearmed and expanded, the rest of Europe watched with concern, but moved slowly. Some leaders believed another war could be avoided through negotiation. Others hoped the threat would fade on its own. But history was moving quickly, and soon, peaceful talks would no longer matter. Meanwhile, in Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and later the United States, leaders and ordinary citizens alike began to sense the approaching storm. Soldiers trained, airfields expanded, ships were repaired and strengthened. No one wanted war, but everyone understood that freedom was at risk. And then, the spark came. Germany's invasion of Poland in September 1939 shattered the fragile peace. Europe awoke to the horrifying reality. War had returned, and this time, it would be bigger, deadlier, and more destructive than anything the world had ever seen. Nations began choosing sides. Families prepared for bombings. Soldiers marched toward uncertain futures. And thus began the long, brutal struggle, a struggle that would test courage, unity, and the very meaning of freedom. As the world plunged into war, the first shockwaves traveled swiftly across Europe. The invasion of Poland was not just a military strike, it was a chilling message. Armies marched with ruthless precision, and the skies roared with the sound of aircraft diving toward their targets. Civilians fled burning towns as resistance fighters struggled to hold the line. The brutality was immediate, and the world realized that this conflict would be unlike anything before. Britain and France, bound by their promise to protect Poland, declared war on Germany. Yet in those early months, their response seemed slow and cautious. Known as the phony war, soldiers waited on the Western Front, staring across empty fields toward enemy lines. There were no major battles, yet only silence, tension, and the heavy knowledge that something far worse was coming. Meanwhile, Germany strengthened its war machine. Factories worked day and night, producing tanks, artillery, and aircraft at a breathtaking pace. Strategy rooms buzzed with plans to expand deeper into Europe. To the world, it was clear that Germany's ambitions would not stop with Poland. In April 1940, the skies finally erupted. Germany launched a swift and coordinated assault on Denmark and Norway. The attacks were precise, overwhelming, and unstoppable. Within hours, Denmark surrendered. Norway held out longer, but the blitzkrieg, Germany's lightning-fast war tactic, proved devastating. Then came the most shocking turn. Germany launched one of the most audacious invasions in modern history, striking simultaneously at Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. The attacks were fierce. Cities shook under the thunder of artillery. Civilians ran for cover as buildings collapsed around them. With every passing hour, it became clear that Germany was attempting to dominate Europe through speed, surprise, and fear. France, believing its massive fortification, the Maginot Line, would protect it, found itself outmaneuvered. German forces bypassed the defenses, cutting deep into French territory. Panic spread as soldiers and civilians alike struggled to understand how the enemy had advanced so quickly. In the midst of chaos, a miracle emerged: the evacuation at Dunkirk. Trapped on the beaches, hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers awaited doom. But then, in an unforgettable moment of courage, fishermen, merchant ships, and civilian boats sailed across the English Channel to rescue them. Against all odds, more than 300,000 lives were saved. Dunkirk became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, unity could withstand terror. Though France would fall soon after, the spirit of resistance began to rise. Across occupied Europe, whispers of rebellion grew louder. People refused to surrender their freedom. The true fight was only beginning. This was the turning of the tide, the moment when the world realized that survival would require extraordinary courage. After the fall of France, a heavy silence swept across Europe. City after city had crumbled under the weight of war, and now only one major nation stood between Germany and total domination of the continent. Britain, the island nation, had become the last beacon of resistance in Western Europe. But across the Channel, German forces prepared for an attack unlike anything the world had ever seen. This battle would not begin on land, it would begin in the skies. In the summer of 1940, dark shadows descended over Britain as waves of German aircraft crossed the English Channel. Their mission was clear: destroy Britain's defenses, crush its air force, and pave the way for a full-scale invasion. London, Southampton, Portsmouth, Coventry, no city was safe. Air raid sirens wailed through the streets as families rushed into underground shelters. Children clutched blankets, mothers whispered prayers, and above them, the world thundered with the roar of engines and explosions. But Britain was not defenseless. The Royal Air Force, outnumbered, exhausted, and using older aircraft, rose to meet the threat. Young pilots, many barely in their 20s, soared into the sky, knowing the odds were against them. Some had only weeks of training, others had never seen combat. Yet every day, they took off, guided by a single purpose: protect their home. Their courage became legendary. Dogfights erupted high above the clouds. Trails of smoke spiraled across the sky. Bombers and fighters clashed in desperate battles where seconds meant life or death. Radar stations and advanced technology at the time helped Britain detect incoming raids, giving pilots precious minutes to prepare. As the battle intensified, Germany shifted its focus. Instead of targeting defenses, it began bombing major cities at night. This phase, known as the Blitz, was one of the darkest chapters of the war. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Streets glowed with fire. Yet in the morning, people emerged from shelters, dusted off debris, and carried on with their lives. Shopkeepers reopened. Trains ran. Children returned to school. The spirit of the nation refused to break. And then came the turning point. Despite being outnumbered, the RAF fought relentlessly. Their determination, combined with strategic brilliance, slowly pushed back the German assault. Losses mounted on both sides, but Britain held firm. By October 1940, Germany postponed its invasion plans. For the first time, the Nazi war machine had been stopped. The Battle of Britain became a shining symbol of hope, proof that bravery and unity could defy even the strongest of enemies. Across the world, people began to believe that this war could still be won. The battle for freedom was far from over, but a vital victory had been secured. As Britain stood firm against the storm in the West, a new and far deadlier chapter of the war was about to unfold in the East. In 1941, Germany prepared for one of the largest military operations in human history, an invasion so vast, so brutal, and so ambitious that it would reshape the entire course of World War II. This operation was code-named Operation Barbarossa. For months, German forces had gathered quietly along the Soviet border. Tanks were hidden under camouflage nets, artillery positioned in dense forests, and 500,000 soldiers stood ready for the command to push forward. Though the two nations had signed a non-aggression pact, Germany never intended to honor it. The plan was simple, yet terrifying. Crush the Soviet Union in a lightning-fast assault, seize its resources, and eliminate its ability to resist. On June 22, 1941, the silence shattered. At dawn, Germany launched a massive attack along a 2,900-kilometer front. Thousands of aircraft bombed Soviet airfields, destroying hundreds of planes on the ground. Columns of tanks thundered through border defenses, tearing deep into Soviet territory. Millions of soldiers surged forward in coordinated waves, overwhelming everything in their path. The Soviet Union was caught off guard. Communication broke down. Commanders struggled to understand the scale of the invasion. Whole divisions were encircled, cut off, and destroyed. Villages burned, roads filled with refugees. It was a catastrophic beginning, one of the darkest the Soviets had ever faced. But the story of the Eastern Front was not one of easy victory. Despite immense losses, the Soviet people refused to collapse. Factories were dismantled and moved thousands of kilometers east, away from the front lines, where they would continue producing weapons day and night. Civilians, men, women, and even children joined the struggle, building defenses, digging trenches, and supporting soldiers in any way they could. As summer turned to autumn, Germany pushed deeper into Soviet territory, reaching the outskirts of major cities like Leningrad and Moscow. But then came the one force no army could escape: the Russian winter. Temperatures plunged below 30°C, engines froze, weapons jammed. Soldiers wrapped themselves in blankets and rags, desperately trying to stay alive. The German advance slowed, then stalled. Meanwhile, Soviet reinforcements, hardened by the cold, launched counterattacks that pushed the enemy back. Operation Barbarossa, which was planned as a quick victory, turned into a grinding, bloody struggle. Millions of soldiers and civilians would lose their lives. Entire cities would suffer unimaginable devastation. And yet, the Soviet Union endured. The Eastern Front became the heart of the war, the place where freedom and tyranny clashed with unimaginable force. The battle for freedom was entering its most brutal phase. As the war raged across the Eastern Front, the world began to understand a chilling truth. This conflict was no longer confined to Europe. It was becoming a global struggle, drawing nations from every corner of the world into its flames. And on the morning of December 7, 1941, the war would change forever. Across the Pacific Ocean, far from the frozen battlefields of Russia, the sun rose over the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. Sailors prepared for a quiet Sunday. Some cleaned decks, others enjoyed breakfast, and a few wrote letters home. There was no warning, no sense of danger, only peace. Then, without a single declaration of war, the skies filled with aircraft, Japanese bombers and fighters, executing a meticulously planned surprise attack, descended upon Pearl Harbor with ruthless precision. Explosions rocked the harbor. Battleships were torn open by torpedoes. Flames shot high into the sky. Sailors leapt into burning waters as the attack intensified. Smoke swallowed the coastline. In less than 2 hours, the United States had suffered one of the most devastating military strikes in its history. The world held its breath. The attack had a single purpose: cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet so Japan could expand across Asia and the Pacific unchallenged. But instead of breaking America's resolve, it ignited it. The very next day, the United States declared war on Japan. A few days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. The conflict had officially become a World War I that would reshape global history. Now, the three great Allied powers, Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States, found themselves united against the Axis. Their strategies, armies, and resources would be tested in battles across oceans, deserts, jungles, and frozen wastelands. This unity marked a turning point. For the first time, the fight for freedom had gained the strength it needed to push back. But the path ahead was steep. Japan swept through Southeast Asia at lightning speed, capturing territories and establishing a vast empire. British and American forces retreated as Japanese troops advanced through the Pacific Islands. Entire regions fell under occupation. Civilians suffered harsh conditions, and soldiers faced a relentless enemy who refused to surrender. Meanwhile, the U.S. began rebuilding its navy, training millions of soldiers, and launching a massive industrial effort that would become the backbone of the Allied war machine. Factories produced ships, planes, and weapons at speeds never imagined. America was awakening, and it was preparing for a long fight. The world was now fully engulfed in chaos. But amidst the devastation, a new hope emerged. The forces fighting for freedom were stronger, united, and ready to reclaim the future. The tide of war was beginning to shift. With the United States now fully engaged in the war, a new wave of determination spread across the Allied forces. Factories thundered day and night, producing aircraft, ships, and weapons at a rate the world had never seen. Soldiers trained relentlessly, preparing for battles across continents. Yet in 1942, the Axis powers appeared stronger than ever. They controlled vast territories in Europe, Asia, and the Pacific. Freedom seemed distant, but the Allies were ready to strike back. The first major turning point came in North Africa, a region of scorching deserts, endless dunes, and brutal combat. For nearly 2 years, German and Italian forces under the command of the skilled General Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, had dominated the battlefield. His strategies were swift and unpredictable, pushing British forces to the edge of collapse. Entire tank divisions vanished in sandstorms of war. But the Allies refused to surrender North Africa. Control of the region meant securing Mediterranean trade routes and protecting the Middle East. It was here that Britain found strength in a new commander, General Bernard Montgomery. Under his leadership, Allied troops were reorganized, reinforced, and prepared for a decisive showdown. That moment arrived at El Alamein. In October 1942, the desert erupted with fire. Tanks clashed in massive formations, artillery thundered across the dunes, and soldiers fought fiercely through the night. The battle was relentless, but Montgomery's strategy slowly broke the Axis lines. After days of brutal fighting, Rommel's forces began to retreat. El Alamein became a symbol of hope, proving that the Axis war machine could be stopped. Meanwhile, thousands of miles across the Pacific Ocean, another turning point was unfolding: the Battle of Midway. Following the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan sought to destroy the remaining U.S. aircraft carriers and seize control of the Pacific. Their plan was bold and complex, but American intelligence had cracked Japanese communication codes, giving the U.S. Navy a rare advantage: knowledge of the enemy's attack before it happened. On June 4, 1942, the skies over Midway Island erupted in combat. Dive bombers soared downward, torpedoes streaked across the sea, and aircraft carriers burned as explosions tore through their decks. The battle raged for days. When the smoke cleared, Japan had lost 4 of its most powerful carrier ships that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor. The U.S., against all odds, had won. These victories, El Alamein in the desert and Midway in the ocean, marked a turning of the tide. For the first time, the Allies were moving from defense to offense. The path to freedom was still long and filled with danger, but the world could finally see a glimmer of light in the darkness. The battle for freedom was beginning to rise. By 1943, the momentum of the war was shifting. The Allies had won critical victories in North Africa and the Pacific, but the battle for Europe was far from over. The next phase would take place on the continent's southern edge, a gateway that, if captured, could open the path to Germany's heart. This massive strategic push began with the invasion of Italy. The campaign started in Sicily, a rugged island guarded by steep hills, narrow roads, and heavily fortified positions. In July 1943, the Allies launched Operation Husky, one of the largest amphibious assaults the world had seen. Under the cover of darkness, thousands of ships and paratroopers moved into position. Before dawn, the beaches erupted with gunfire as Allied forces stormed ashore. The fighting was intense. Soldiers clashed in dusty villages, tanks rolled across rocky terrain, and aircraft battled overhead. But within weeks, Sicily fell. The victory sent shockwaves through Italy, where the government, exhausted by years of war, began to crumble. The Italian leader was removed from power, and soon after, Italy surrendered. Yet the campaign was far from finished. German forces, refusing to abandon Italy, took control of the northern half of the country. They built strong defensive lines across mountains and rivers, determined to slow the Allied advance. As the Allies pushed northward, they encountered some of the harshest fighting of the war. Muddy roads, icy peaks, and deadly ambushes turned every mile into a struggle. Battles like Monte Cassino became symbols of endurance. For months, Allied troops fought to break through. German fortifications built around a historic monastery perched on a hill. Artillery shook the mountains. Smoke covered the valleys. Thousands of soldiers fought desperately for every inch. Only after relentless assaults did the defenses finally collapse. Meanwhile, the Eastern Front continued to rage with unimaginable ferocity. In the city of Stalingrad, the Soviet Union fought one of the bloodiest battles in human history. Streets became war zones. Buildings were reduced to skeletal ruins. Soldiers battled room by room, floor by floor, often armed with little more than determination. When winter arrived, the Soviet counterattack trapped an entire German army inside the frozen city. The surrender of German forces at Stalingrad marked a historic turning point. It shattered the myth of Nazi invincibility and electrified the Allied cause. Across Europe, resistance movements grew stronger. Occupied nations whispered of hope once more. The year 1943 became the year the world realized something powerful. The Axis could be defeated. The road ahead would still be long and filled with sacrifice. But the Allies were gaining strength, unity, and confidence. The battle for freedom was moving ever closer to Germany's doorstep. By 1944, the Allies had built a powerful momentum on every front. But one decisive objective still remained: the liberation of Western Europe. Nazi Germany had fortified the coastline of France with bunkers, mines, barbed wire, and artillery positions stretching for miles. This massive defense was known as the Atlantic Wall. To break it, the Allies would need the largest amphibious invasion in human history. This operation would be remembered forever as D-Day. In the months leading up to the invasion, Allied planners worked with extraordinary secrecy. Millions of tons of supplies were gathered: tanks, aircraft, landing craft, ammunition, and food. Thousands of soldiers trained on British beaches, learning how to storm fortified positions under relentless fire. At the same time, a brilliant deception campaign convinced Germany that the invasion would occur elsewhere near Calais, not Normandy. Finally, on the night of June 5, 1944, the greatest armada the world had ever seen set sail across the English Channel. The sea was rough, the wind was cold, and every soldier aboard knew that the next sunrise could be their last. Before dawn on June 6, paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines. Many landed far from their targets, scattered across fields and hedgerows. Yet they fought bravely, cutting communication lines, capturing key bridges, and sowing confusion among German defenses. Then came the main assault. As morning light broke, thousands of landing craft approached the beaches: Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword. The doors dropped open, and soldiers plunged into freezing water under a storm of bullets, artillery, fire, and chaos. Some were hit before their boots touched the sand. Others crawled through explosions, using steel obstacles as cover. The air was filled with smoke, screams, and the roar of naval guns firing from offshore. Omaha Beach was the deadliest. Steep cliffs, machine gun nests, and obstacles turned the shoreline into a nightmare. But through sheer determination, small groups of soldiers pushed forward, scaling cliffs, destroying bunkers, and slowly breaking the German line. By nightfall, the impossible had been achieved. Over 156,000 Allied troops had landed in Normandy. It was the beginning of the liberation of Europe. Villages celebrated as soldiers marched through their streets, while resistance fighters emerged from hiding to join the battle. The Germans, overwhelmed by the size and strength of the Allied assault, struggled to regain control. But the fight for France was far from over. Ahead lay hedgerow country, dense fields, and narrow pathways perfect for ambushes. Every mile fought for, every village taken, came at a heavy cost. Yet the world now believed, more than ever, that freedom was returning. D-Day had opened the gates. The march toward Germany had begun. The landings at Normandy had cracked open Hitler's fortress. But the battle to liberate France was only beginning. Behind the beaches lay a maze of hedgerows, thick, tangled walls of earth and vegetation that stretched for miles. These ancient barriers turned every field into a battlefield, every corner into an ambush. For the Allied soldiers, pushing inland, Normandy became a slow, grinding struggle. German resistance was fierce. Tanks hid behind hedgerows, firing without warning. Snipers waited in church towers. Machine gun nests turned village streets into deadly traps. Progress was measured not in miles, but in meters. Yet the Allies persisted, fighting day after day, through smoke, dust, and the echo of artillery that never seemed to stop. One of the most crucial battles in this deadly landscape was the breakout at St. El. Here, American forces launched a massive bombardment that shook the ground for miles. When the smoke cleared, soldiers advanced through shattered fields and burning ruins, finally breaking through the German defenses. This victory opened a path for an aggressive armored push known as Operation Cobra. Suddenly, the Allies began to move with incredible speed. Tanks roared across open countryside. Troops pressed forward through abandoned fortifications. The German lines, stretched and exhausted, began to collapse. In response, Hitler ordered one final, desperate counterattack at Falaise, hoping to cut off advancing Allied forces. But instead, German armies found themselves trapped in a tightening circle. The Falaise pocket became one of the war's most decisive moments. Allied troops and aircraft rained fire on the retreating German forces. Smoke choked the valley. Roads became graveyards of destroyed vehicles. By the time the pocket closed, an entire German army group had been shattered. France was now open. With the enemy in full retreat, Allied forces swept forward. On August 25, 1944, joyous crowds filled the streets of Paris as French and American soldiers liberated the city. Flags waved from windows, bells rang from towers, and tears flowed freely. After 4 years of oppression, Paris was free again. Across Europe, similar scenes played out as towns and villages welcomed their liberators. Resistance fighters embraced Allied troops. Families returned to homes they thought they'd never see again. Every step forward carried the promise of freedom. But the war was not over. Germany was wounded, but not defeated. As Allied forces approached its borders, the fighting grew fiercer. Ahead lay the Siegfried Line, the Ardennes, and battles that would test the world once more. Normandy had opened the door, but the march into the heart of darkness had only just begun. After the success of D-Day, the Allies pushed deeper into France. But what awaited them was a battlefield unlike anything they had trained for. Normandy's countryside was divided by thick hedgerows, dense walls of earth and vegetation that provided perfect cover for German ambushes. Every field became a trap, every corner a potential kill zone. German soldiers, experienced and determined, fought fiercely to hold their ground. Tanks struggled to advance through narrow paths while snipers hid among leaves, waiting for the perfect shot. Artillery echoed across the landscape as villages turned into battlegrounds. The Allies advanced slowly, often gaining only a few meters a day. Yet despite the danger, they continued forward. By late July 1944, the Allies launched Operation Cobra, a massive breakout designed to shatter German lines. Thousands of aircraft roared overhead, carpet-bombing enemy defenses. When the smoke cleared, Allied tanks surged through weakened positions, creating a gap that grew wider and wider. The Germans, exhausted and overwhelmed, began to retreat. Meanwhile, in the south of France, another Allied force landed during Operation Dragoon, pushing north and joining the advance. France was being liberated on two fronts. The most emotional moment came in Paris. For years, the City of Light had suffered under Nazi occupation. Its people lived in fear, resistance fighters operating in secret, dreaming of freedom. In August 1944, their dreams became reality. As Allied forces approached, the French resistance rose up, capturing key buildings and confronting German troops. After days of fierce street fighting, German commanders surrendered. On August 25, 1944. Allied soldiers marched triumphantly into Paris. Crowds cheered, waved flags, and embraced the liberators. Bells rang across the city. Tears flowed freely. Paris was free again. But even as Europe celebrated, the war was not over. Germany still held Belgium, the Netherlands, and much of Eastern Europe. The winter ahead would be harsh, deadly, and unforgiving. Hitler prepared a last desperate counterattack, one that would shock the world and threaten everything the Allies had fought for. The liberation of France was a critical victory, but the road to final freedom still stretched far ahead. The war was entering its final, most unpredictable phase. After securing the beaches of Normandy, the Allies pushed inland into France. But victory did not come quickly. Beyond the beaches lay a vast maze of fields, divided by tall hedgerows, thick walls of earth, and vegetation that had stood for centuries. These natural barriers turned every advance into a deadly challenge. German troops used the terrain perfectly, hiding in trenches, barns, and forests, waiting for the Allies to move into their traps. Progress was slow, brutal, and costly. American forces fought fiercely through places like Carentan, St. L, and the deadly hedgerow country. Tanks struggled to maneuver, infantry advanced yard by yard, and sniper fire echoed across the countryside. Every village liberated came at a high price, yet the Allies pushed on relentlessly. Meanwhile, British and Canadian forces battled to capture the strategic city of Caen, defended by elite German units. Weeks of heavy fighting, artillery bombardments, and airstrikes finally shattered the German lines, opening the path for a massive breakout. Then came Operation Cobra, with a thunderous wave of bombers blasting holes in the German defenses. American forces surged forward, breaking out of the hedgerows and racing across open fields. The German front collapsed. Tanks, infantry, and armored columns poured into the gap, spreading out across France with incredible speed. The Germans attempted one last stand in what became known as the Falaise Pocket. Trapped between advancing Allied forces, entire German divisions fought desperately to escape. The valley became a scene of chaos, burning vehicles, shattered roads, and soldiers fleeing through smoke-filled fields. Thousands were captured, thousands more killed. It was one of the most decisive defeats Germany had suffered. With German defenses in ruins, Allied forces liberated Paris on August 25, 1944. Crowds flooded the streets, waving flags, cheering, and embracing the soldiers who had restored their freedom. For the first time in years, the sound of celebration replaced the echo of war. But the road ahead remained dangerous. Germany was not yet defeated. Ahead lay forests, rivers, and the German border, each step bringing the Allies closer to the heart of the enemy. The liberation of France was a triumph, but the war was far from over. As the beaches of Normandy turned from battlegrounds into supply corridors, the Allies began their push deeper into France. But progress was far from easy. In the weeks following D-Day, soldiers faced a new and unexpected enemy: the thick, maze-like hedgerows of Normandy. These ancient earth walls, dense with vegetation, created natural fortresses perfect for German ambushes. Every field became a deadly trap, every corner a potential kill zone. The Allies struggled to move even a few miles each day. Tanks could not pass through the narrow lanes without exposing themselves. Infantry advanced slowly, cutting paths through walls of shrubs as German snipers fired from hidden bunkers. The air hung heavy with smoke and the cries of wounded men. Many soldiers later said that hedgerow fighting was more terrifying than the beaches. But the Allies adapted quickly. Engineers devised special hedgerow cutters that allowed tanks to burst through the walls. Paratroopers and infantry coordinated attacks with artillery and aircraft. Village by village, the Allies pushed forward, forcing German troops into retreat. As the front expanded, cities across France began to rise with hope. And then came one of the most symbolic moments of the entire war: the liberation of Paris. For 4 long years, Paris had lived under occupation. Its streets were patrolled by German soldiers, its buildings draped in Nazi banners. Resistance fighters, operating in secret, risked their lives to sabotage railways, deliver messages, and gather intelligence. By August 1944, with Allied forces nearing the city. The French resistance launched an uprising. Barricades rose in the streets, gunfire echoed from rooftops, and crowds chanted for freedom. General Charles de Gaulle demanded that Paris be liberated, not just by the Allies, but by French forces themselves. On August 25th, French armored divisions rolled into the city. Crowds flooded the streets, waving flags, climbing onto tanks, and cheering with joy. The sound of church bells rang across the skyline for the first time in years. Paris was free again. The liberation electrified Europe. It proved that the German occupation, once vast and unbreakable, was beginning to collapse. But the war was far from over. Ahead lay the borders of Germany, fortifications, forests, rivers, and the last desperate defenses of a regime unwilling to surrender. The Allies had reclaimed France, but now they faced the most dangerous stage of the war. The road to freedom would soon lead into the heart of darkness itself. While Europe rejoiced in victory, the Pacific remained engulfed in brutal conflict. Japan's empire stretched across islands and oceans, defended by soldiers who had vowed never to surrender. The United States and its allies prepared for some of the harshest battles of the entire war. The island-hopping campaign moved steadily forward. At Iwo Jima, one of the most iconic battles unfolded. The island, dominated by volcanic rock and fortified with tunnels and bunkers, became a fortress of resistance. American Marines landed under heavy fire, crawling across black sand as bullets rained down. The fighting lasted weeks, with casualties on both sides mounting. In the end, the island was captured and the photograph of soldiers raising the flag atop Mount Suribachi became a symbol of courage. Then came Okinawa, the last major battle before reaching Japan itself. It was a storm of fire and steel. Kamikaze pilots plunged their aircraft into Allied ships. Ground forces fought through villages, ridges, and caves. The cost was staggering. Tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians lost their lives. Yet victory brought the Allies one step closer to Japan's mainland. But the final invasion and assault on Japan itself would have caused catastrophic casualties. Faced with this reality, the United States made a decision that would change history forever: the use of the atomic bomb. In August 1945, atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, unleashing destruction unlike anything ever seen. Cities vanished in blinding light. The world entered the nuclear age, an age of terrifying power. Devastated and facing inevitable defeat, Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. After years of suffering, fear, and loss, World War II was finally over. The world emerged, changed. Nations were rebuilt. The United Nations was formed to prevent another global catastrophe. Millions mourned their loved ones. Heroes were remembered. And from the ashes of war, new commitment to freedom and peace rose. The battle for freedom had been long, brutal, and costly, but it had prevailed.